We say culture is important, culture matters. Well, how?
We're powered by our brains. We're not always rational. We are influenced by others.
I think I'd start with looking at what's called the better than average effect.
So one of the things we look for picking flight directors is what we call command presence, right? You kind of just look at people like, you better get it together. We got stuff to do, right?
Good practice would be for a leader to say, well, this is a mistake I made recently, and this is what I did about it.
I can't emphasize enough the disempowerment of the lonely decision maker.
So the opposite of what we think of as an ethical decision frame, we can think of as a game frame.
It doesn't make you unethical to wrestle with this. The smart money is we help you to try to figure this out.
This is Banknotes, Banking Culture Reform. The views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System.
Hi, and welcome to the Banking Culture Reform podcast, part of the New York Fed's initiative to drive awareness and change in financial services culture. This series, Norms, Mindsets, and Decision-Making, explores questions like, why do ethical people do unethical things? How can organizations encourage staff to speak up and executives to listen up? And what role does context play in shaping people's behavior? My name is Tony DiCario, and I'm a member of the New York Fed's culture team. Today, we're speaking with Betsy Levy Paluck. Betsy's a professor of psychology and public affairs at Princeton University. She studies the way group norms are shaped and changed, including how social perceptions and networks can be used to influence behavior change. We first featured Betsy when she was a panelist in our webinar on how diversity, equity, and inclusion influence organizational culture. In this episode, Betsy will explain, among other things, why we're really all just middle schoolers at heart. Thanks for joining us, Betsy. Welcome.
Thanks for having me here, Tony.
Maybe we could start off with kind of a broad introduction to your work, and you could talk a little bit about what motivated you to study social psychology.
I'll tell you one story about the first study I ever worked on as a research assistant, what it says about the appeal of social psychology for me, and it's relevant to some of the things we're going to talk about today. I worked on a study of sexual harassment. It was an experiment in which the professor who I was working for, Marianne LaFrance, and her graduate student, Julie Woodzicka, posted an ad in a Boston newspaper for research assistants, and they invited in women who really believed they were coming in for an interview. And they were randomly assigned experimentally to either be asked about God or asked about whether they would wear a bra to work in the course of this interview with the same guy who interviewed all of them. So the idea was, ask everyone something weird and kind of inappropriate, but in one case it was a sexualized question. And unbeknownst to these women who were fully debriefed afterward, there was a camera recording their reactions to these questions. So I'm wondering if you can guess, did people answer the question about whether they believed in God and whether they would wear a bra to work? Do you have any idea? Was there a difference?
Oh, yeah. I suspect that people did answer the question about whether they would wear a bra to work and thought that the God question was totally inappropriate and said so.
So actually, there was no difference. Everyone answered it. Everyone wanted the job. And it was pretty undetectable what question they were asked. So my job was to turn off the volume and just watch these women's faces as they were asked this question. And it turned out that the only way you could really tell the difference between these women and the way that they smiled and self-presented in these interviews was just how much they smiled. So when they were asked about whether they would wear a bra, they didn't have what, at the time in this study, we described as the Duchenne smile, the smile where you smile with your whole mouth and even your cheeks. With the God question, they were more likely to actually smile out of surprise, out of shock, somewhat, uncomfortable amusement, but they answered. And so that was something that I think a lot of people wouldn't have predicted at the time, that given the situation in which women were in this position of very little power, they needed the job, many people thought that the women would refuse to answer the question. And the experimenters even gave them an out. They gave them a chance to complain about the interviewer afterward, and almost no one did. I just thought, I want to be one of the scientists who is working on questions of such macro political importance, but boiling it down to those micro level moments day by day that you don't realize how power rears up its head in these kinds of moments. It got me hooked, and I started working on questions later on when I was a graduate student of social norms and how people could, surprisingly, you wouldn't predict it, participate in things like mass violence or discrimination or hate crime. but given the right circumstances, given the right kind of leadership or peer pressure, et cetera. So that's how I got into this.
I love the way that you describe these kind of big macro issues and these issues of such import that feel really overwhelming. And the ability to kind of break that down into kind of tangible, bite-sized learnings is so important. So one of the kind of central questions that we're trying to answer with this podcast is, why do otherwise ethical people do unethical things?
Why do ethical people do otherwise unethical things? And I think that one of the big ideas of social psychology is that it's kind of hard to just label someone an ethical person. It's hard to label oneself anything that will endure situation to situation for eternity. We definitely like to think of ourselves as ethical, and many of us try very hard. And that is a top value, to be ethical, in all of these different situations in our lives. But I think that the big idea is that there are individual differences, but also there are these, situational, contextual pressures on us. And so it's better to ask about ethical and unethical cultures, or ethical and unethical situations. And it's not to say that we have no free will or, possibility to assert our values in these various situations, but social psychology really recognizes that sometimes we can even think of ourselves as acting in an ethical way, but it's the water that we're swimming in is directing us, in certain types of ways that we now come to think of as ethical, but we wouldn't have judged it in that way to start. It's very hard to overcome the perspectives afforded by your surroundings. So I would say that we would point to contexts and not always people in terms of, why would an ethical person do this? It's more like, why wouldn't you do this in an fundamentally unethical situation?
Explain what you mean by why wouldn't you make the unethical choice if the context around you is encouraging it? Is that what you mean?
I think that we can start from the premise that most humans are striving to see themselves and to be seen as upstanding people, as ethical people, as people who can be counted on, et cetera. This is part of our drive for self-esteem and so forth, not in terms of just feeling so good about oneself, but just the true meaning of esteem, which is to think of oneself in a positive light. I think that, certain circumstances redefine behaviors for us. This is one way in which circumstances can change the ways in which we behave, even when we're striving to be ethical. So certain behaviors that perhaps outside of the situation we might label as unethical, they start to seem as ethical, perhaps because most people are doing them, and perhaps because along with that, they are justified using different standards than we would normally use. And so all of these kinds of ideas, framing how certain behaviors are framed, norms, how many other people do them or think them to be either typical or desirable, and then personal accountability and responsibility. I think you see them in the sort of postmortem breakdowns, right? When people are trying to explain why they've done something unethical. I think that we're really good at seeing them in 2020 vision, right? That we're looking back and saying, well, these are all of the things that I realized pushed me to do these things. We're less good at recognizing them in the moment, right? You'd really have to, be bicultural. You'd have to be, a fish that swims in two seas. And very few of us have that privilege, right? We're immersed where we are. And so maybe we can see it in retrospect when, someone comes to punish us or to question us. But it's very hard to detect that in the moment. And that's the compelling thing about being a human, is that we get our reality from those around us, from the way issues are framed, from the way that we're led, et cetera.
One of the things you talked about was framing. The thing that I think about often in this context is kind of when I first learned the phrase normalization of deviance. It was actually reading a study of the Challenger disaster, and there was a problem with an O-ring. And so there were people raising this issue, saying this is a problem. But those who had lots of experience, who had been there before, were saying, yeah, but we're on a tight deadline. We've got a lot of pressure on us, and this has never been a problem before. And so this is kind of, how do you help people gain the confidence and the clarity to say, no, this isn't okay, and to kind of push the topic.
So dissent is a really great example. It's a topic that I've studied a lot in the past, in part because I've worked in countries where there's been a genocide. And one of commentators' favorite things to say about countries that have had a genocide is that they must be a very authoritarian context with very little dissent. People must just be ready to follow orders. That must be somehow in their bloodstream. I don't think that's the case. I do think that dissent can be something that is cultural, however, that is encouraged and that's framed, as we're talking about. That's a named practice, a sort of recognized cultural tool. And I think that two things have to go together. So one would be this kind of framing or naming of the behavior. So in this case, it would be dissent or speaking up in a meeting. I think that what has to happen is dissent itself has to be named as an action, as a behavior, and almost branded in a way so that when you're doing it, you can say, well, I'm going to do this now. It has to have a positive connotation. A lot of people speak up in meetings, I think, when they're worried about disagreeing with people to say, well, what about this devil's advocate position, right? So people sometimes frame it this way to maybe soften the blow, or I'll say to my graduate students, well, what if a reviewer were to say this to you in your paper, right? So they frame it in ways that make it more socially acceptable to speak out in disagreement or to critique. But the other thing that has to happen is that they have to see that it is acceptable by watching others do it. And so this is really the critical tipping point issue for many cultures, for many organizations, is that not only do you have to name it as a desirable practice, but you have to show people who are doing their social reality testing all the time. They're looking around at others and saying, okay, you say that dissent is desirable, but is anyone else doing it? And so you need to seed it, SEED, seed it, within the folks at your organization or in a society so that you can both name it as a desirable cultural practice and believe it, not just, declare it so, but actually look around and see that other people recognize that you're doing this thing that has been encouraged and that they're doing it themselves. And lots of people have different ideas about how to spread these ideas through an organization. Some people really argue that you have to focus on the ground up, that you have to look at a social network and say, get the people who are sort of most surprising to adopt these behaviors first. Maybe they're not really the highest places in the hierarchy, because as the work of Jen Daniels and Dale Miller would show, they would say, it's always really informative to look at people who are actually at the bottom of the totem pole, look at what their behaviors are, because we just assume that they're following the norms, the regulations, right? They're not like improvising here. They don't have enough power to do so. So if you look and see what people who are in sort of the lower strata of this hierarchy, what they're doing, you sort of think, well, if they're dressing up, then, it's probably a dressier place. Other people have ideas that it should simultaneously come from the top, that leadership should name the practice, and that opinion leaders should be adopting it so that those who get the most attention in an organization are the ones who are spreading it. And we've done some work on that, showing that can successfully spread norms. So that's the idea, is that, you have to try to make it cultural and starting to think about where you sort of encourage this practice is part of what I do in my own work is think about networks and how to do a little bit of social engineering with them to make things seem more cultural.
So you said that in cultures that experience genocide, there's always been this assumption that there's not dissent, but that's actually not true. There is, and people are speaking up. It would seem to me as if maybe they're not being heard, or at least not being effective in their dissent. And so what makes dissent effective?
Well, what makes dissent effective? Sometimes all it takes is a minority opinion. Sometimes that's a very powerful thing in a group. And there's been a long tradition of work on group discussions in psychology that shows that single person or, a pair of people who are the minority of a group, their dissenting voices can really change, if not, the nature of the decision, it can change the degree of the decision, and it really can shape group discussion in very helpful ways. things can also be really overtly structural first, right? That we say, well, we're going to red team this idea. So that's a journalistic idea of, we have this official, actual group of people that comes in to question a decision that's been reached. And so I think, having these sort of meso-level structures, like groups of people who are formed with this express purpose and the license to do this, is another way to think about this until this sort of gets into the water. I think also then we need to be very careful of the way power is distributed too. I mean, if we want to go back up to the macro level and to politics, well, dissenters are often silenced because they're simply crushed by political power, machinations. And so even at the organizational level, one must be very careful that the red team has sufficient power that, there isn't the case that this is done for performance, right? Or for even just helping the original team to just justify their views, just to flush out all of the objections, come up with, ways to argue against the dissent, but that there's a balance of power in terms of the people who are discussing diverging viewpoints.
So going back to the water that you're swimming in, do you think that there is something about finance potentially or banking? Is there something about the water that influences the ethicality of decisions, in your view? Might there be?
I have to say that one thing that psychologists aren't very good at is history. We're trained to look at the world around us right now and the constraints on us right now as we're making a decision. We're not alone in this, though. I think that, everybody forgets history, and that's part of what makes culture is just this built up, routinized way of doing particular things. And there might be something about the history of the sector that could contribute to certain types of decision making, maybe individualized, concentrated in certain pockets of power, whose voice counts in these sectors. So that's something I'd like to point to as a weakness in my analysis, but one that I'd want, to attend to from a psychological standpoint. I think also, though, you need to think about the structure of an organization. This is something maybe we're better suited to do, is to say who in this moment is making most of the decisions, who is consulted, or are there consultation processes that are put in place. And psychologists, we think a lot about voice and identity, right? And so would this seem as ethical to a decision maker if they were making the decision in front of this group, in front of that group, whose identities are considered as different decisions are made? I am not an expert on the financial sector, and so I think that those are the questions that I would ask. I mean, part of the reason that I was attracted to social psychology is that, to harken back to this earlier example I was giving of women being sexually harassed in an interview, if you ask most women whether they would speak up if they were sexually harassed in an interview, even back then in the 90s when this experiment was being done, I think they would say, well, at some point I would, maybe not right exactly in that moment, but they didn't. We're not always good at predicting our behavior. And so our actual behaviors don't align with our projections, our values. And so that's the point, though, that it's helpful to ask these questions about ourselves rather than, try to make judgments about whether this or that sector is particularly primed for unethical decisions.
I want to get back to what you were talking about in terms of our ability to predict our own behavior and identity and what our visions are of ourselves, and get a sense from you of how much do you think that decisions, day-to-day decisions at work, are driven by a particular identity versus social norms and kind of others' expectations of us as kind of manifested through culture?
What's more important, your personal identity or the norms, the cultural norms, in terms of what's pulling on you to influence your behavior? I would say that it's just impossible to pull those two apart because norms belong to certain identities. And that's what's tricky about norms, is that you could have a norm at your company about compassion or care for the climate or ethics, but if you don't feel that that norm applies to you, right? We really think that norms have these little identity tags with them, so this group of people thinks that this is really important. I'm not one of those types of people, right? So the trick is to really try to communicate a norm, suffuse it throughout the entire organization so that, belonging to the company or working at this institution, the norm is about that identity, that really holistic identity, rather than, the social justice warriors in, this branch of the company, or, the younger people who care about this stuff, or the old timers who are really interested in moving in this direction, right? And so the real trick of, sort of a cultural engineer who wants to change the patterns of behavior in a multicultural, multi-identity space is to work on creating that shared identity. And then you have the grounds on which to build norms, right, about that identity. If people don't feel like they belong to your organization, then you've lost your ability to really reach everyone in that powerful way. I still think there's a way to build shared norms even when there isn't a very strong common identity, but that's harder. That means that you have to try to build the norm in each of the groups, right? And we've tried doing things like that in middle schools, which are notoriously sort of defined by different grades and different cliques within grades, defined by race and class and interests. So, working with the people who are very important to each of those identity groups, we were trying to change conflict levels and norms about conflict at the overall school level. And we had some success. But I'd say that's a really uphill challenge. If you have the capacity to do it, really working on that shared identity, making people feel like they belong to some common home with a shared identity, that's a really strong basis to work off of.
So you said that you had some success in trying to create some shared identities. Can you talk about what you think contributed to that success?
I think that the success that we had, Tony, was not in this particular case in working in middle schools, was actually not in creating a shared identity. And it's especially key for that developmental age. That's when you're actually trying to establish an identity, as separate from your parents, as, you're going out into the world, you're trying to find your group. So we actually didn't try to create a shared identity at these middle schools. What we tried to do instead was to work with all of the different groups and choose people in those different groups' networks who were important to them, and work with those folks as opinion leaders to try to change everybody's ideas simultaneously of what was desirable at that school. For that reason, it was really critical for us to work with people who are normally not picked for, opinion influencer positions, because they were coming from groups that don't even have high status within the school. So I think about this with respect to organizations quite a bit as well, because you don't have to be, a 14-year-old to be entering an organization and trying to establish yourself and establish an identity and distinguish yourself from others. It's not always the case that you come to an organization, you try to be like everyone else. That just doesn't make sense career-wise, right? So I think that, the middle school comparison, fits uncomfortably well for a lot of adults, actually, and from this very different developmental stage. And so sometimes it could be really difficult to build a shared identity. And instead, it really makes sense to try to understand an organization very well and who are the different identity groups there, and to address the norm that you want to build of dissent, of ethics, of fair treatment, of compassion, whatever the case may be, within each of those groups and with the people in those groups that matter to those different identity groups.
When I think about the organizations that we are thinking about, they range in size, but their cultures are enormous and have, a ton of those subcultures that you talked about. And it sounds like from your description, there's really no way to skip the hard work of trying to understand them one by one.
I think that, like so many things, thinking locally is often the most effective, right? And so I would say that applies to identities and norms as well, because the people who you really care about are those who you go to work with and see every day. And the feedback that you care about is not just from a more distant supervisor, but from your peers who you're working with. This is the other hard thing, is that when you want to try to, have leaders model some kind of behavior that you hope to diffuse throughout a large network, a large place, sometimes the examples of that behavior doesn't make sense to everyone. There are many people in an organization who actually aren't even in a decision-making position. They're supporting those decisions. So what kind of information do they send up to the decision maker? What kinds of objections might they raise? What cautions would they attach to certain bits of information that they're sending along to decision makers? So if people have different roles in the process, then also thinking about the role that they play and what does ethical behavior look like for them.
Do you have thoughts about how the pandemic has potentially influenced our decision-making behaviors?
I have to say, like everybody else, one reason why I'm struggling with this question is that I just don't know what other people are thinking right now. We've been isolated from one another. We haven't had time to check in and to form impressions of what others are doing. I'm not sure. I haven't done research on it, and so it's hard to make generalizations. I think that this is a time of such unsettledness. So there's a sociologist, Ann Swidler, who talks about settled and unsettled times. Settled times are, those times in between disaster, pandemics. She actually studied the AIDS epidemic, was the unsettled time when everyone's trying to figure out what to do again, how to think again. Psychologists talk a lot about, short-term versus long-term thinking. I think that folks aren't even sure what kind of thinking to do right now. And so this is where I think guidance goes a very long way. Some more centralized guidance or feedback from peers goes a very long way toward forming up and firming up our impressions of how to behave going forward.
That's interesting that it is actually probably a good time to try and establish norms, if ever there were a time to step into the space. You gave some recommendations about, if you're an organization that's trying to affect better decision-making, more ethical decision-making, one of the things you mentioned that you might think about is really trying to engage with and understand individual subcultures within an organization and what they value. Do you have any other recommendations for an organization looking to imprint positive decision-making?
I would want to know more about whether the folks who you're working with, your colleagues, your reports, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to make better decisions? Is this a goal of theirs? As a psychologist, you always want to know what way the tide's going, right? Are you working with or against the tide? If you're working with the tide, if you feel that people are already trying to do better and they have this motivation to do better and something's in their way, then it's a detective story about, well, what are the obstacles to them making better decisions and more ethical decisions and more broad thinking, et cetera. And that is more likely to be successful. When the tide is against you, when they don't share your goal, that's a lot more difficult. Then you need different tools. Then it's not about removing obstacles to their path. It's not about, the sort of the famed behavioral science advice of make it easy, make it available. You could make arsenic, easily available to me. I'm not going to drink it. I don't want to drink it. Then you want to try to pair their motivation to try something new with something that they're already very motivated to do. I'll use this, example that was made into a great example of norms by Debbie Prentice, which was trying to get men in the American South to stop dueling back around the time of the inception of the United States. They were dueling all the time, as many people remember from Hamilton. And it was against the law, but it happened all the time. And men were not refusing a duel because it would be against your, sort of upper class gentlemanly honor to do so. So how do you fight against that? I mean, we've been asking this for a very long time now. Like, how do you fight the tide of masculinity, right? Well, it turned out that the most successful project for reducing dueling was to disqualify men who dueled from running for office. And what was so compelling about that was that these men were in positions where that was also considered a masculine duty for men of their class was to run for office. And so it gave them not just motivation to not duel, but a face-saving out to say, I cannot duel. I owe a duty to my county, to my state, et cetera, to represent them. So, I just offer this up as a metaphor. So this is sort of it's not exactly the same as as carrot, right? It's not saying we'll pay you $100 to, come get vaccinated. I think it's more psychologically sensitive. It says, here's something that's very important to your identity, perhaps in some ways important to the same identity that's driving you to do this other thing. So can we let these two compete, and can we give you an out? Now, the important thing about this case of dueling is that you could die if you dueled. So probably a lot of men did want to get out of dueling. It just shows you the difficulty, right? That, if people really want to do what they're currently doing, you're trying to stop them. Well, psychology might not always be the ultimate answer, these psychological manipulations in that case. So trying to figure out how to, frame and introduce and enforce new regulations, maybe psychology will work with you on that. But this is my basic advice, is to first go in and say, which way is the tide running? Are they going with you? Are they going against you? And so it's a different conversation. And it's a very hard hill to climb if they don't want to do this. I do think that if you find situations where you can characterize it as, in their heart of hearts, they wish they didn't have to do this to have high status, you've found a moldable feature of your organization. That's good news.
I want to share with you something that one of our other interviewees talked about, because I think you touched on this a little bit, and I'm curious about whether you have thoughts on it. One of the academics we talked to is a woman named Taya Cohen, and she's at Carnegie Mellon. And she does a lot of work on guilt proneness and how much guilt proneness leads to good decisions, ultimately, is what she finds. But another thing that she studies is game mindsets. So she says that a lot of what can lead to unethical behavior is when you're in a context where you're playing a role. And so you're not bringing your own kind of moral awareness or rationalizing to that game, because that's not what one of the rules of that game is or are. And you kind of touched upon that. I'm curious about whether you have any reactions to that framing of why people might make bad decisions.
It sounds to me like what you're describing is one way of making people feel simply more accountable, right? Is reminding themselves that they are themselves within this role. There's a lot of interest among behavioral scientists in general, I think, in trying to get people to slow down, to stop and reconsider from different angles, rather than rotely follow the rules of the role that they're in, of the group that they're in, and so forth. I think all of these are really interesting tactics. I'm really interested in what happens when you can do that with a whole group, though, because I think that what a lot of these kinds of tactics rely on is the individual decision maker. And from my perspective, I can't emphasize enough the disempowerment of the lonely decision maker, and I want to get away from this individualization of the problem. I think that roles are roles because they're in relation to others. And so you feel an obligation to carry out this role vis-a-vis others. And so maybe we can provoke you to feel more yourself within this role and critically evaluate what would I really like to do as opposed to what this role is asking me to do. But I think that it's really easy for the role to win out because it's ultimately obligations to other people. And so a lot of these kinds of fast thinking versus slow thinking and reconsider from a different position, I'd love to see these be more social as interventions. So getting a team together to think, how do all of your roles contribute to these kinds of outcomes? How do your interrelationships to one another, your obligations to one another, end up in you deciding the same kinds of things every time that are maybe suboptimal for the following reasons? I think I'd be really interested in those kinds of interventions. So basically making things more social.
My last question is whether there are any resources on any of the topics we've talked about today that you'd recommend listeners.
I think that, one resource that a lot of your listeners may be paying attention to if they're interested in decision-making and psychological and economics views on it is a new edition of Nudge was just published. And so it's a look back at all of that work and a reconsideration of what's worked well and what really holds up over time and how to think about this. So that would be good summer reading, I think, for everyone interested in this. I would hasten to say that there's sort of this middle level that I just want to keep encouraging everyone to think about, which is, on one hand, you've got behavioral scientists talking about individuals and how individual people decide. And on the other hand, they talk about, well, here's choice architecture and how to design policies at your organization that affect everybody. I think somewhere in the middle is we have to think about groups of decision makers and their relationships to each other and their identities. I'll recommend a little paper that I wrote with my student that was published this past year, where it's sort of a nice takeoff on the nudge book, which is we were trying to think about, how to recognize culture when you design nudges and identities. And so we were working in a Chinese factory and trying to help them with this problem of just how to get people to change their behavior on the floor of the factory, how to get them from directing their waste in a different way. My student came up with the most ingenious nudge, which was to paste these religious symbols on the floor, these religious Buddhist symbols that had been blessed by monks, that the workers were told this has been blessed by monks. And it was a really sharp drop-off in people dropping some of this waste on the floor, because that had such meaning for people that they understood this is a different space now. And my student is herself Chinese and worked with the monks to have these blessed and to introduce them to the factory workers. It was a very simple way to take into account some of the things that I've been talking about.
That's fascinating. Okay, so we have one kind of quirky question, Betsy. Is there anything else that you are reading, watching, listening to that you can't get enough of and that you're wanting to tell everybody that you know about and that you want to share with us?
In my spare time, I'm actually reading a lot of narrative nonfiction to try to redesign this policy class, but I'm reading in that way where you can't even let yourself get completely engrossed and excited. I'm reading with a purpose, frantically in small bits. I don't recommend it to anyone.
For more conversations like this, as well as publications and other resources related to banking culture reform, please visit our website at newyorkfed.org/governance and culture reform.